Jessica was always the kind of person who could light up a room. Her confidence was magnetic, and her ambition was unlike anyone I'd ever met. She didn't just talk about big dreams, she pursued them relentlessly. When we first met, she told me she wanted to launch her own fashion brand one day, a goal she called her ticket to the big leagues. At the time, I was working as an operations manager, and while my job was steady, it didn't spark the same passion I saw in Jessica. She thrived on creativity and challenges, constantly sketching designs and jotting down ideas for future collections. It was inspiring to watch her work, and it made me want to support her in every way I could. In the early days of our marriage, our life revolved around planning for her dream. I'd spend my evenings at the dining table with her, crunching numbers while she worked on her designs. We weren't rich by any means, but we made it work. Every spare dollar went toward materials, trade shows, and networking events. I believed in her vision as much as she did. When Jessica finally found a partner to help her apply for a grant to fund her first collection, it felt like we'd reached a turning point. Her partner, Nate, was someone she'd met at a fashion seminar in Philadelphia. According to Jessica, he was a marketing whiz with an impressive portfolio and connections in the industry. "He's the real deal," she said one evening, her eyes bright with excitement. "He knows exactly what buyers want, and he's already helped a few brands blow up. With him on board, I think this could actually happen for me." I was thrilled for her. After all, this was the moment we'd been working toward for years. I told her I'd support her every step of the way, no matter what it took. "You've been my rock," she told me one night, leaning against me on the couch. "I couldn't have done this without you." But as the weeks went by, I started noticing small changes. Jessica's energy was different, more focused, more intense, but also a little distant. She was spending more and more time with Nate, working late into the night and traveling for meetings I didn't fully understand. At first, I brushed it off. This was a critical time for her career, and I figured the long hours were part of the process. Still, something about the way she talked about Nate didn't sit right with me. She praised his skills and ideas constantly, and while I wanted to be supportive, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their partnership than she was letting on. I tried to push those thoughts aside, telling myself I was being paranoid. After all, I trusted Jessica. We'd built our life together on love and mutual respect, or so I thought. In the past few weeks, Jessica's demeanor had shifted in ways I couldn't ignore. She had always been an open book, eagerly sharing every detail of her workday, from minor triumphs to her biggest frustrations. But now she was different, more secretive, more guarded. She started leaving the house earlier than usual, often muttering something vague about early meetings with Nate. At first, I didn't think much of it. This was a critical time for her business, after all, and I figured she was just putting in the extra hours to get things done. But then came the late nights. She'd text me around dinner time saying she was swamped with work and wouldn't be home until late. By the time she got back, I'd already be in bed, and she'd slip into the room quietly, offering little more than a mumbled goodnight. One evening, I tried to ask her about the project. "How's everything coming along? Did you make progress with Nate?" She barely looked up from her phone, scrolling through what seemed like endless emails. "It's complicated right now," she said, brushing off my question with a half-hearted smile. "Sorry, dear. I'll tell you more when things settle down." Her words stung, but I didn't push her. I told myself she was just stressed. This was her big break, and she wanted everything to go perfectly. But as the days turned into weeks, her distant behavior became harder to ignore. I started to notice little things. She was glued to her phone constantly, smiling at messages she never shared with me. She spent extra time getting ready in the mornings, carefully picking out her outfits and doing her makeup in a way she hadn't bothered with in years. When I teased her about it one morning, she just laughed and said, "You always have to look your best in this industry." Even our conversations felt different. When we did talk, it was like she was only half listening, her mind somewhere else. I missed the way she used to light up when she talked about her ideas, the way she'd pull me into her excitement. Now, it felt like there was a wall between us, one I couldn't seem to break through. One evening, Jessica came home exhausted, barely speaking, before heading straight to bed. She mumbled something about a long meeting and deadlines as she climbed under the covers and fell asleep almost immediately. I stayed downstairs, scrolling on my phone, but my thoughts kept drifting back to her strange behavior over the past few weeks. As I made my way to the kitchen to grab a drink, I noticed her laptop sitting open on the counter. Normally she was meticulous about shutting it down or taking it upstairs, but tonight she had clearly forgotten. The screen glowed faintly, showing an open email thread. I hesitated. I'd never been the type to snoop, but something in my gut told me that this was my chance to get some clarity. Taking a deep breath, I stepped closer and began to read. The emails were between Jessica and Nate, her so-called business partner. At first, they seemed professional enough, discussions about budgets, upcoming presentations, and strategy meetings. But as I scrolled further, the tone began to change. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about it. Let's do it again soon. That was Nate's message. Jessica's reply was equally damning. Me too. I haven't felt this alive in years, but we have to be careful. He doesn't suspect anything yet. My stomach churned as I stared at the screen, reading the words over and over, hoping I'd misunderstood. But there was no mistaking the meaning behind those messages. Trying to calm myself, I minimized the email thread and saw a document labeled budget statements open on the desktop. Curious, I clicked on it. And what I found only deepened my sense of betrayal. The document was a breakdown of expenses for Jessica's project, but something didn't add up. There were multiple entries showing significant withdrawals from our joint account, amounts I hadn't agreed to or even knew about. There were payments for luxury hotel bookings, high-expense restaurants, and gifts marked as client expenses. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. Jessica hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, she was using our hard-earned money to fund her affair. I closed the laptop and sat down, my mind racing. The woman I'd supported for years, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, was living a double life. I wanted to wake her up and demand answers, but I knew I needed more than just what I'd seen so far. If she could lie to me so easily, I couldn't trust her to come clean. I needed proof, solid, undeniable proof, before I confronted her. That night, as I lay awake beside her, I realized my suspicions weren't just paranoia. Something was very, very wrong, and I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered the truth. The next morning, Jessica was back to her usual routine, dressed to perfection, sipping her coffee as she scrolled through her phone. Watching her act so carefree, so normal, made my blood boil. I couldn't look at her the same way after what I'd seen on her laptop, but instead of confronting her outright, I decided to dig deeper. That evening, after Jessica went to bed, I waited until I could hear her breathing slow into the steady rhythm of sleep. Quietly, I reached for her phone on the nightstand. She always had it with her, but tonight, for whatever reason, she hadn't thought to take it into the bathroom or hide it away. The phone was locked, but I knew the passcode. It was my birthday, ironically enough. My hands trembled as I unlocked it and began scrolling through her messages. The thread with Nate was still there. This time the messages were more recent and even more damning. Can't wait for tomorrow night. Same hotel, Nate had written. Jessica's reply was quick. Of course, I'll handle the check-in. Just bring the wine. I felt a cold wave of anger wash over me. There was no ambiguity here, no room for doubt. They were meeting at a hotel, and it wasn't to discuss business strategy. As I scrolled further, I found photos that made my stomach turn. Selfies of Jessica and Nate at fancy restaurants, laughing together, a picture of her holding his hand across a table. But the worst was a series of photos taken in what looked like a hotel room, Jessica lying on a bed, her hair disheveled, wearing a look I hadn't seen in years. I put the phone down, my hands shaking. The betrayal was real, and it was staring me in the face. She wasn't just sneaking around. She was using our money to fund this affair, living a double life while I was at home believing we were still a team. But even in my anger, I knew I couldn't explode yet. If I confronted her now, she'd deny it or twist the narrative, and I wouldn't get the closure I needed. I had to think carefully about my next move. For now, I saved the photos and messages to my own phone. Evidence. I needed to have it all lined up before I exposed her lies. The weight of it all settled on me as I sat alone in the dark. I wasn't just hurt. I was angry, humiliated, and determined to make her face the consequences of what she'd done. After everything I'd found on Jessica's phone, I knew I couldn't let this slide. Confronting her immediately would only give her time to spin her web of lies tighter, and I needed her to feel the full weight of what she'd done. So, I decided to take a different approach. I would gather more evidence, not just for myself, but to ensure there was no escape for her when the time came. My goal wasn't just to end this sham of a marriage, it was to expose her deception in a way she couldn't deny or manipulate. First, I started by documenting everything I already had. The messages, the photos, the suspicious financial transactions. I saved it all on a secure drive. I also combed through our bank statements, looking for any other unusual expenses. Sure enough, there were more charges that didn't add up. Spa treatments, high-expense restaurants, and a few luxury purchases I didn't recall her mentioning. I also reached out to a close friend of mine, Eric, who worked in cybersecurity. I didn't tell him everything, but I hinted at marital issues and asked if he could help me recover deleted data from Jessica's laptop and phone. Eric didn't pry, he just nodded and said, "Send me what you have. I'll take care of it." While Eric worked on that, I decided to dig into Nate. Who was this guy? Really? What kind of person not only cheated with a married woman, but also convinced her to jeopardize her own family's finances? A few quick searches revealed more about him than I expected. Nate wasn't just some smooth-talking business partner. He had a reputation for shady deals. There were rumors of failed partnerships, unpaid debts, and even accusations of fraud. He was the kind of guy who charmed his way into opportunities and left chaos in his wake. Learning this made my blood boil. Not only had Jessica betrayed me, but she had tied herself, and by extension me, to someone who could ruin us financially and professionally. At this point, I decided I needed to see them together. I needed irrefutable, real-time proof of their affair. So I hired a private investigator. It felt like something out of a bad TV drama, but I was desperate. The PI, a no-nonsense woman named Clara, assured me she'd get the evidence I needed. "Give me a week," she said. "I'll find out everything." In the meantime, I played the part of the clueless, supportive husband. Jessica had no idea I was onto her. She still came home late, still acted distracted, still smiled at her phone like a giddy teenager, and every time she did, my resolve hardened. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to dismantle the fantasy she'd built with Nate piece by piece. The week felt endless as I waited for Clara, the private investigator, to report back. Every day, I watched Jessica go through the motions of her double life. She'd kiss me goodbye in the mornings, texting furiously the moment she thought I wasn't looking, and come home late with vague excuses about meetings running over. It was infuriating to see her so comfortable in her deception. Finally, Clara called. "You were right," she said. "There's more to Nate than just bad business practices. You're going to want to hear this in person." When we met at her office, Clara laid out everything she'd found. Nate wasn't just a fraud. He was a predator. He had a history of wooing women, particularly those with resources, and using their connections and money to fund his own schemes. There were whispers of lawsuits, unpaid business partners, and even former affairs where he left women in financial ruin. But what shocked me the most was that Nate's schemes weren't always legal. Clara showed me documents that hinted at money laundering and tax evasion. Jessica wasn't just involved with a liar, she was tied to someone whose actions could land her and potentially me in serious trouble. "What about Jessica?" I asked, bracing myself for the answer. Clara handed me photos and a detailed timeline. "She's deeply involved," she said. "They've been meeting regularly at that hotel." "But there's more. She's been transferring funds from your joint account to a separate one. That account is tied to Nate's business." My stomach dropped. "You're saying she's funding him?" Clara nodded. "Yes. And based on these transactions, she's also using some of that money for personal expenses. It looks like she's all in with him, emotionally, financially, and possibly legally." I stared at the evidence, a mix of anger and disbelief coursing through me. It wasn't just an affair. Jessica had put our family's financial future on the line for this man. "Do you think she knows about his reputation?" I asked. Clara shrugged. "Hard to say. People like Nate are good at manipulating their way into people's lives, but she's not innocent. Not with this level of involvement." Armed with this information, I knew I had to act. But this wasn't just about confronting Jessica anymore. It was about protecting myself and ensuring I wasn't dragged down with her. I met with a lawyer the next day. I laid out everything: the affair, the financial transfers, the connection to Nate's shady business dealings. The lawyer's advice was clear. Document everything, protect your assets, and be prepared for a messy fallout. I went home that evening with a heavy heart. As much as I hated what Jessica had done, part of me still couldn't believe it had come to this. The woman I had loved, supported, and trusted had become someone I didn't even recognize. But there was no turning back now. The truth was out, and it was uglier than I ever imagined. Jessica had been planning a big presentation to unveil her secret project to potential investors. She had talked about it for weeks, bragging about how it would be her breakthrough moment. She insisted this event would put her name on the map in the fashion industry. To everyone else, it looked like the culmination of her hard work and ambition. To me, It was the perfect stage for the truth to come out. I arrived at the venue unannounced, dressed in a suit and carrying a folder packed with evidence Clara had collected. Jessica looked radiant, confidently addressing the crowd, weaving tales of innovation and her bright vision for the future. Nate stood off to the side, looking smug as ever, clearly relishing his role in the charade. As the applause died down after her presentation, I stood up and addressed the room. My voice was steady, though my heart pounded in my chest. "Excuse me, everyone," I began. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to me. "I have something important to add about this project." Jessica froze, her eyes widened as she recognized me, panic flickering across her face. "Kevin, what are you doing here?" she hissed. I ignored her and walked to the front of the room. I opened the folder and began laying out everything I had discovered. The financial statements showing questionable transfers, the evidence of her personal involvement with Nate, and even the documentation tying Nate to his history of fraud. "For those of you considering investing in this venture," I said, holding up one of the incriminating documents, "you should know where your money is going and who you're entrusting it to." The room erupted into murmurs. A few investors began flipping through the papers I handed out, their expressions darkening as they read. Nate stepped forward, trying to maintain his composure. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice strained. "Kevin, you have no idea what you're talking about." "Really?" I shot back, pulling out a photo of Nate and Jessica at the hotel. "Care to explain this, Nate? Or maybe Jessica would like to." Jessica's face was beet red and she stammered, "This isn't the time or place for this." "Kevin, stop this now." "No, Jessica," I said firmly. "This is the perfect time and place. You've been lying to everyone here, to me, to these investors, to your so-called supporters. It's time they see who you really are." The murmurs turned into full-blown conversations as people began packing up and leaving. One man, who I assumed was a potential investor, turned to Jessica and said, "You've wasted our time. Don't ever contact me again." Jessica stood there, paralyzed as the room emptied around her. Nate, true to form, slinked out without a word, leaving her to face the fallout alone. As the last of the audience filed out, Jessica turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "Why would you do this to me?" she demanded. "Why?" I repeated, my voice trembling with anger. "Because you did this to yourself, Jessica. You lied to me, you betrayed me, and you risked everything we had for some pathetic fantasy." She tried to speak again, but I held up a hand. "Save it," I said. "You've lost everything now, your investors, your reputation, and me. I hope it was worth it." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the venue, leaving her standing there alone, surrounded by the wreckage of her deceit. The fallout from the presentation was swift and brutal. Jessica's project, which she had poured so much of herself into, or so I thought, was dead in the water. The investors she had so carefully courted pulled their support immediately. Rumors of the scandal spread quickly through her professional circles, and her reputation took a nosedive. Nate, unsurprisingly, disappeared. Clara had warned me he had a habit of cutting ties and vanishing once things started to go south, and he didn't disappoint. He left Jessica to face the consequences alone, proving once and for all that he was as unreliable as I'd suspected. Jessica tried to salvage what she could. She sent desperate emails to the remaining investors, apologizing and promising to clear her name, but it was too late. Her financial backers wanted nothing to do with her after learning about the shady financial dealings and her personal betrayal. At home, the atmosphere was tense and unbearable. Jessica oscillated between anger and despair, blaming me one minute and begging for forgiveness the next. "You've ruined everything, Kevin," she yelled one night, tears streaming down her face. "Why couldn't you have just talked to me privately?" I stared at her, barely able to contain my frustration. "Ruined everything?" I shot back. "Jessica, you ruined everything the moment you lied to me, to our family, to everyone who trusted you. You don't get to shift the blame onto me because I exposed the truth." She fell silent, and for the first time I saw a flicker of regret in her eyes. But it wasn't enough. Words wouldn't undo the damage she'd caused. Meanwhile, I began the process of separating our lives. 6 months later, we wrote down the lies, you and I. I contacted my lawyer to begin divorce proceedings and worked to protect myself from the financial fallout of her reckless actions. It turned out she had racked up significant debts, both personally and through her business. Thankfully, my lawyer assured me I wouldn't be held liable for most of it, but the thought of how close she'd come to ruining us completely made my blood boil. The hardest part was explaining things to our friends and family. I kept the details vague, saying only that Jessica and I were separating due to irreconcilable differences. People could sense there was more to the story, but I didn't owe them an explanation. Jessica, on the other hand, wasn't as reserved. She tried to spin the narrative in her favor, telling mutual friends that I had overreacted and blown things out of proportion. By the way, but the truth had a way of coming out, and once people learned the real story, her attempts to gain sympathy fell flat. As the weeks went by, I started to feel a strange mix of emotions. There was anger, of course. Anger at Jessica for her betrayal, and at myself for not seeing it sooner. But there was also a sense of relief. For the first time in years, I felt like I was no longer living in a web of lies. Jessica, meanwhile, was left to pick up the pieces of her life. Her career was in shambles, her relationship with Nate had imploded, and her once inflated ego was nowhere to be seen. Filing for divorce was both the hardest and easiest decision I'd ever made. Hard because it meant the official end of the life I thought I had with Jessica, and easy because staying with her after everything she'd done wasn't an option. Trust had been obliterated, and without trust, there was nothing left to salvage. The process itself was messy, as I'd expected. Jessica fought tooth and nail to protect what little reputation she had left, painting herself as the victim. She tried to argue that the financial decisions she made were for the greater good of her project and that my actions had been unnecessarily harsh. But the evidence I had, the bank transfers, the emails, the photos, and the video footage, painted a very different picture. Bigfoot says, my lawyer presented everything in court, and it was enough to ensure that I wouldn't be held accountable for the debts Jessica had racked up. Jessica's demeanor in the courtroom was a far cry from the confident, ambitious woman I had once known. She looked defeated, her once proud facade cracked and crumbling. Seeing her like that was bittersweet. Part of me still cared about her, or at least the version of her I'd fallen in love with, but I couldn't let that overshadow the reality of what she'd done. When the divorce was finalized, it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter, as if I could finally start breathing again. Jessica, on the other hand, was left to deal with the fallout. She was responsible for her debts, and her reputation in the fashion world was all but destroyed. Nate had left her high and dry, and as far as I knew, she was struggling to rebuild both her personal and professional life. For me, the divorce marked the beginning of a new chapter. I moved out of the house we had shared and into a modest apartment closer to the city. It wasn't much, but it felt like a fresh start, a blank canvas on which I could begin to rebuild my life. I focused on work, throwing myself into projects and leaning on the support of friends and family. The betrayal still stung, and I knew it would take time to fully heal, but I was determined not to let it define me. The freedom I felt was strange at first. For so long, I had been tied to Jessica and her ambitions, trying to support her while putting my own needs on the back burner. Now, for the first time in years, I could focus on myself, on what I wanted, on who I wanted to be. It's been several months since the divorce was finalized, and while the scars of betrayal remain, I'm starting to find my footing again. Life without Jessica has been an adjustment, but it's also been liberating. For the first time in years, I'm living for myself, not for someone else's dreams, not under the weight of someone else's lies. The memories of Jessica and what she did still creep up on me from time to time. Sometimes it's a song we used to listen to or a photo that pops up unexpectedly. It stings, but not as much as it used to. I've stopped blaming myself for her choices, and that's been the biggest step forward. What she did wasn't about me. It was about her own insecurities and selfishness. I've also taken the time to reconnect with friends and family. During my marriage, I unknowingly drifted away from people who cared about me, caught up in trying to support Jessica and her ambitions. Now, I'm making an effort to rebuild those bonds. I've been honest with them about what happened, and the support I've received has been overwhelming. It's a reminder that even when life knocks you down, there are people who will help you back up. It's going to be one of the most important lessons I've learned is that trust takes time to rebuild, not just with others, but with myself. I'm learning to trust my own instincts again, to listen to that inner voice that was telling me something was wrong long before I wanted to admit it. Moving forward, I'm cautious but hopeful. I don't know when or if I'll be ready for another relationship, but I do know that I'll never settle for anything less than honesty and respect again. Life has a way of surprising us, and while this chapter was painful, I'm determined to make the next one better. Here's to starting over, one step at a time. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Tell me what you think about that story. Have a good day, and bye.